Gresham College presents Thinking Theologically about Modern Art, Part 1, The Desublimation of Modern Art, a Theological Task, by Professor Ben Quash.
I believe in keeping announcements to and introductions absolutely minimalist, so that there can be more time for discussion. So without more ado, I'm now going to welcome Professor Ben Quash. Though let me just say very few words why we're mounting this together, Ben Quash and I. During this last year, in my role as Gresham Professor of Divinity, I've been doing a series of lectures on Christian faith and modern art. But I've been focusing upon how modern artists have responded to what you might call the challenge of modernism, the different styles they've developed in order to meet that challenge with artistic integrity. I've not done very much theological reflection, so it seemed very good to have a whole day of theological reflection on the whole phenomenon of modern art, and I'm delighted that Ben and I, between us, have got such a good range of people to introduce this discussion. If you haven't seen those lectures, if I can just say, they are all available to see, download, or read on the web through the Gresham College website. I've always been lucky enough to feel that I've done in life what I have wanted to do and got paid for it. And if I felt that about my job, how much more must Ben feel that about his job as Professor of Christianity and the Arts at King's College, London. Is there anybody here who doesn't want to be Professor of Christianity in the Arts at King's College, London? I can't imagine a single hand would go up. The envy of everybody, and we're very lucky to have Ben here with us. Ben, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I do have to pinch myself sometimes when I wake up, just to really feel the reality of the privilege of the job. So the title of this talk is The Desublimation of Modern Art, a Theological Task, ? And it's prompted by a slightly unlikely conversation that was set up for me in King's quite soon after I arrived there. Somebody in the School of Arts and Humanities had the idea that it would be good to foster more interdisciplinary conversation across subject boundaries, and chose as a theme to occasion these conversations the theme of creativity, and found all the people in the different departments in King's who in some way or another dealt with creativity in a very broad way, and paired them up so that they could have a conversation with one another. And I was paired up with a woman called Vivienne Jabri, who's one of our academics in war studies. I'd never met her before, and she isn't in any way religious, or I don't think particularly interested in religion. But the talk she gave I found completely fascinating. She talked about the shock and awe tactics that were used in the Second Iraq War, and particularly the bombing of Baghdad. And she talked about the visual impact of those tactics in terms of the sublime, the aesthetic of the sublime. She felt that this was a deliberate harnessing by American military authorities particularly of an aesthetic in order not only to achieve the military objective of subduing Baghdad and Iraq more generally, but making a statement to a wider audience, a global audience in fact, that this was a supreme power, a supreme military power expressive of a supreme political power that you just simply could not mess with. And these were extraordinary and in a horrible way mesmerizing images. But her main point was to say that she saw a task for the modern artist in response to this. She decried it. She felt that the shock and awe aesthetic was absolutely appalling. She thought the task of the contemporary artist was to bring before our eyes the effects that this had on actual bodies, human bodies. To be an art attentive to the devastation, the human devastation that was being wrought by these magnificent firework displays that we were seeing on our television screens. And she called that challenge to the artist the challenge of desublimation. In other words, countering the bad sublime that was being used by for military and political ends. And that's what rang a bell, and that's the sort of thing I've been thinking about since, about what as it were, a Christian theological affirmation of the body might also entail in terms of a response to the sublime. So I hope that will become clear as I talk. And I want to then take a big step back to that period when the parting of the ways between the idea of the beautiful and the idea of the sublime really happened. That's to say, the late 17th, early 18th century. Another thing to say, just by way of a sort of precursor, is that, of course, a sense of specific, particular place, places in which, the spaces in which bodies are, and which bodies can be seen and honoured and are not simply annihilated or lost to view, is something to which Christianity is very committed, as is Judaism before it. Place, as Walter Brueggemann, the great scholar of the Old Testament, says, place is space which has historical meanings, where some things have happened which are now remembered and which provide continuity and identity across generations. Place is space in which important words have been spoken, which have established identity, defined vocation, and envisioned destiny. Place is space in which vows have been exchanged, promises have been made, and demands have been issued. Gardens, mountains, seas, deserts, promised lands, foreign cities. You can't tell the story of God and God's people without these. Places that you're sent to, places that you want to get to but can't, places you're in but want to get out of, places where God surprises you because you didn't expect God to be there, places where God promises to dwell so that you do expect him to be there. And there is, of course, a tension going on in the Old Testament between place and not place. The temple precipitates that. Brueggemann also suggests a loss of divine dynamism is associated with the building of the temple. In the Gospels, of course, the importance of place is less easy to define. Events certainly take place in named locations, and sometimes in significant ones, such as the temple. But there's also a valid case for saying that place becomes less significant because Christ's holiness transcends the holiness of specific geographical place. It may be argued that for Christians there is no distinction between sacred and profane, since all is God's creation and since the universality of the single divine power implied by monotheism makes nonsense of the notion that any place is the site of a special divine activity. I'm grateful for some of this to one of my PhD students, Chloe Redaway, who's working specifically on the idea of space and place and working it through a study of Florentine frescoes in Florence. Renaissance frescoes in Florence. To this one may add the argument that with the coming of Christ, the old model of sacred place epitomized in the Temple of Jerusalem is replaced by Christ himself. And that becomes, as it were, a mobile place. Christ moves. The sacred sanctuary, which is his body, is mobile. Perhaps in a sense it's a recovery of the idea of the divine presence or the Shekinah in the pillars of cloud and fire, respectively, which move and lead the people behind them. Well, that was a little preamble, and I now want to summarize what is going to be the main claim in this paper. And it has to do, as I've hinted already, with how something has gone wrong since the medieval and Renaissance eras I just referred to. And this something is closely bound up in the shifts in philosophical thinking, both about religion and about aesthetics, that are going on in the 17th century. And they have a profound effect on the way that we moderns relate to space. To put it very baldly indeed, a sort of warfare is introduced between human beings and the spaces that they inhabit. The world becomes constructed as a place in which human beings are no longer at home. A Christian celebration of space as infused with God's goodness and activity, and as our God-given natural milieu, loses its purchase on the modern imagination. It seems that there can be only two outcomes. In one, we win over space. In another, space wins over us. The arts play their part in endorsing and reinforcing this depressing outlook by accepting a new opposition between the beautiful and the sublime, in which the latter, the sublime, is exalted as profound but dangerous, and the former as pleasing but superficial. The sublime is considered the more real, the beautiful a comforting illusion. The sublime is space running riot, you might say, so that the human form is minimized or obliterated by it. The sublime gestures to a space we cannot contain. The beautiful seems trivial as a consequence. Now, I'm being very broad brush about this, and I also expect George Patterson to disagree with me later, or at least to qualify some of the things that I've said. But I want the claim to be vivid, at least at the beginning of this day. I want the claim to be vivid. And I'm going to illustrate it a little before ending with some suggestions of how a Christian tradition of art, even today, can and should be looked to for a more mediated, affirmative vision of how we and the spaces we live in are related to one another and should relate to one another under God, while preserving perhaps certain important things that the sublime does, in its way, does keep in play, which is to say the radical otherness and transcendence of God. My point will be that God's transcendence can be safeguarded and honoured without a necessary opposition being set up with significant form, the human scale, and even the idea of beauty. So this next section is, we've got to get space before it gets us. By the way, I've put this image up. Actually, I think, George, I got this from you. You talked, when you came to spoke at our Rothko Day a few years ago in King's. George showed this image of G.F. Watts's After the Deluge, and I think in that context, to encourage thought on how certain of Watts's work seem to anticipate modern abstraction. I'm showing it here as a sort of backdrop for the things I've been saying about the sublime. It seems to me that this is an image of sublime proportions in which there is no human scale, despite the fact that in terms of the biblical narrative, it's depicting a moment at which the world is about to, as it were, be restored to significant form. So we've got to get space before it gets us. As so often, Kant crystallizes the problem. There are two aspects of his legacy that I want to highlight here. First, he opposes the infinite to the finite, with the correlate that the sublime, which is, you might say, the art of infinity, is made the opposite of the beautiful, which is the art of proportion and finitude, rather than being seen as a compatible aesthetic partner to it. Burke did his own version of this already, but on different terms. So that's the first Kantian moment I want to highlight, the opposing of the infinite to the finite. But second, he celebrates the power of human reason to stand above this opposition, retaining a sort of mastery even of sublime experience. The viewer of sublime spectacle, if strong enough in his or her reason, comes away with a strengthened view of the powers of the rational mind and can display this mastery in works of art that show infinite sublime space being subjected to rational oversight. You can see why I've chosen this image to illustrate the point. For Kant, one's inability to grasp the enormity of a sublime event, such as an earthquake, demonstrates the inadequacy of one's sensibility and imagination, but simultaneously one's ability subsequently to identify as singular such an event, to think about it, indicates the superiority of one's cognitive supersensible powers. He has this category of the supersensible. So our sensibility might be overwhelmed, but we retain this supersensible faculty in our reason, which can reflect upon the experience of being overwhelmed. We, as it were, are overwhelmed, but can stand above the overwhelmness at another level and think about it, cognize it. Thus, a sublime object can create in us a fearfulness without, as Kant puts it, without our being afraid of it. Can create in us a fearfulness without our being afraid of it. So for Kant, the sublime reveals our superiority over nature. It displays our mind's power over sense. It enables us to appreciate our autonomy. We simultaneously see our physical selves as subject to the overwhelming power of nature, and we see our rational selves as independent of it. So two contradictory tendencies are thus displayed. In one direction, nature's awe threatens to overwhelm us, and in the other direction, the transformation of fear into delight seems to reveal our autonomous superiority, rather like this gent standing on his mountaintop, surveying what is undoubtedly a sublime landscape, mountainous, stretching away to infinity, impossible for us to, as it were, fix its limits in terms of our gaze, but nonetheless, he stands above it, looking rather confident and unruffled, leaning on his stick. Kant may have thought he'd found a way to keep these two contradictory tendencies in play simultaneously, but in practice they've tended to fuel the view that if we don't master sublime space first, it will conquer us. Artistic efforts in the first direction are largely classicizing and rationalist. Nietzsche would have called them Apollonian, perhaps. And artistic efforts in the other direction are what Nietzsche would call Dionysian. And the spirit of contemporary art, it's worth noting, I think, is predominantly a Dionysian one. Well, getting space before it gets us, the rationalist option, the Apollonian option, I think is well illustrated by the campus, Thomas Jefferson's campus at the University of Virginia in the United States. But I don't want to deny that these attempts to tame wild space are not equally observable in Europe, perhaps more commonly on the European continent than in England, interestingly, but that's another conversation. The late Dan Hardy, a great theologian, delivered a lecture at the University of Virginia in 2004, and he'd stood whilst there here at Thomas Jefferson's Rotunda, which is the symbol of the University of Virginia in some ways and the defining mark of Jefferson's architecture for the school. If you stand there at the northern head of the main campus and look south over what is called the lawn, you see elegant brick buildings. Here's an early engraving. Elegant brick buildings to left and right. There's the rotunda at the far end and the lines of buildings stretching down on either side. What you would have seen straight ahead of you, once those apartment buildings stopped, has now undergone change since the campus was first designed and built. Originally, according to Jefferson's vision, you would have seen an unenclosed wilderness beyond. Wild space, sublime space. Subsequently, the pressure for more facilities has caused the southern view to be closed off, so that instead of the open forests, you now see an auditorium and a large classroom building. For Hardy, there was something significant to be discerned about a rationalist imperative, both in the original vision, before the south end was closed off, and in the later cut-off. They symbolized for him an important aspect of what I'm calling a rationalist understanding of the human being's place in God's creation. For Jefferson, he said, reason is a human construct informed by a priori principles inherent in our being or nature. This means that the other nature, the one we find out there, is ultimately unknown and maybe even threatening. Nature is beautiful, to be sure, but also sublime and dangerous. It can be cognized only to the degree that it is domesticated, and it is domesticated only by human rationality. Hardy went on to suggest that this initial way of thinking about nature as other already contained within itself the seeds of the next stage of architectural activity, the closing off of the south side, so as to enclose the lawn. So initially, one adopted the position of a spectator of a nature out there that was other, and this nice frame at the end of the two lines of buildings sort of set it neatly apart, enabled you to look at it, but from the position of a detached spectator. To close it off is entirely to banish it. Whatever the practical reasons may have been for doing it, this too, Dan Hardy felt, symbolized an ongoing failure of vision. Jefferson's Enlightenment standard of rationality could be read as reflecting a distrust of the unknowable in nature. Nature is acceptable only when it accommodates our rational constructs. When nature displays its fury, we would judge it irrational and close it off, limiting reason's gaze to what lies within our precincts. So this is one half of the Kantian tension. We can prove ourselves independent of nature and dominate wild spaces by the exercise of our rational nature. But the other side is that we feel ourselves potentially at the mercy of them. And here is Turner's magnificent picture of a snowstorm, of Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps in a snowstorm. The figures present, but, so tiny as to be to be hard to discern and almost extinguished by the sheer raw power of nature. The rise of the sublime parallels the event of modernity within philosophy, in which God and nature are likewise divorced and set in mutually exclusive opposition to one another. Nature, the world of beings, is transcended by God in a way that really means that God is absent from it, veiled and impenetrable. God's transcendence can only now be understood, it seems, as God's exile beyond the world, occasionally breaking through, perhaps, but only as some sort of alien force, certainly a force threatening to human well-being. And postmodern thought, in various ways, it can be argued, continues to exalt the unrepresentable in direct continuity with this modern trajectory, as though the utterly unrepresentable is being at its truest and most untrammeled. So is being, I should say, as though the unrepresentable is being at its truest and most untrammeled. Being known precisely through its enmity towards the fragile, frozen present of representation. Known at the points when representation, whether conceptual or artistic, is ruptured or dissolved. There isn't time to go into lots of details of how a more recent tradition of art, since the examples I've shown you so far, might be thought of as sublime. But I just want to show you a couple of details from Rakib Shaw's work. Some of it was on show recently at White Cube in St James's, and which I went to see with Tim Marlowe recently. In fact, I did an interview with him. Some of you may have heard it for a programme on Radio 3. As I said there, I really did love seeing Rakib Shaw's work. I thought it was truly extraordinary. It is, in lots of ways, actually beautiful. In terms of the surface effects, the patterning of forms, the extraordinary surface decoration, the use of gems, or at least fake gems, in order to make the surface of the canvas exciting, this almost lacquered effect of the surfaces, the flowers and the animal forms. There's an extraordinary delight that you can take in these surfaces and these images. The art is vivid, immense, and full of an intensity that derives from its hovering between nostalgia for the past and hope for the future, and the ever-present fear that at the root of life there is only entropy. It has a longing for home that's part of its beauty, and I like that. Its visual forms are a dance of connectedness, and I think that's beautiful too. When you start to look more closely, you realise that a lot of the connectedness is savage. A lot of the way that these forms participate in one another take the form of mutual consumption, animals eating one another, or sexual predation, sexual violence, as if you can have connectedness but only on these terms or at this price. That it's somehow a more serious engagement with human connectedness if it's presented in this way. That, of course, is part of how the works surprise us and make us think. They make us ask the question, are these the deepest forms of participation that there are? Can we hope for anything better or other than this? Ought we to look for more? But in fact, what disturbed me most was not the nature of those surface connections, intensive, often violent though they were, played out on the surface of the canvases, but actually the disconnection between surface and depth. I think quite well illustrated by this detail from the Moonbeam Gatherer. Several of Shaw's images show a humanoid figure, often with an animal head, in a sort of despairing attempt to connect with a sublime deep, often depicted as here as the sky, seeking to catch the moonbeams, which are impossible to catch. This impossible relationship with the depths of the canvases, this futile longing. That disconnection between beautiful form and sublime hinterland is precisely the rehearsal in a modern idiom of what I've been talking about as having a long heritage. The forms that floated on the surface may have been bestially connected, but at least they were connected. The one connection that wasn't made was the connection between surface and depth, between, you might say, creation and creation's source or ground. If the surface patterns mean nothing, their formal beauty merely taunts or tortures us. It may be the only kind of beauty we feel we can honestly own in our uncertain day, but it is a painful beauty, and I wonder whether it really merits the name. I want here to quote the words of David Bentley Hart, an American theologian who's written a very dense but very important book on beauty from a theological point of view called The Beauty of the Infinite. And because he writes densely, sometimes enjoyably, certainly colourfully, I've reproduced, there's some other, we won't have time to go into these now, but some other examples where you might be seeing sublimity if you were to wander around Tate Modern, for example. There's Arp's work, Pollock's work, Boccioni. We can come back and talk about those later in the day if you'd like to. Here's David Bentley Hart. The thinking of surfaces, and keep in mind that Rakib Shaw image as you read this, the thinking of surfaces subsists upon an aesthetics of the abyss. He's talking about in much contemporary art. An aesthetics of the abyss, energy, boundless force, indeterminate instabilities, that through the violence of their ceaseless divergence and convergence within an untold depth of the indistinguishable, give rise to the evanescent shimmering of events and forms, those lacquered forms in Shaw's work. The beautiful, conceived as a staid aesthetics of form, limit, boundary, hierarchy, harmony, and accord, becomes simply another manifestation of the essentializing discourse of image and likeness, and of the solace of metaphysics. This is not his point of view, he's describing what he thinks of as a predominant contemporary aesthetic. While the sublime, conceived as the turbid immensity of the unrepresentable, a chaotic excess of indeterminacy, strife, incompatible difference, and inchoate energies, is raised up for affirmation. As a divine game of chance and fate, a game whose only rule is the necessity of the casting of the dice, and whose stakes are always the whole. From this sublimity, beauty can be extracted irrelevantly only as a contraction and a concealment. Metaphysics, in its drive toward totality, classically conceives of the infinite as chaos or negation, or at best a total synthesis, and certainly cannot conceive of an infinity that is offered peacefully, without alienation, negation, or deceit, as form. Well, a concern with the spiritual and an expectation that this spiritual reality will be found at the edges of life, in confrontation with world enigmas or boundless space, is a dominant assumption in contemporary thought and art. Transcendence. If you ask people about what they think transcendence is, very often they will answer in these terms. It's about reaching a limit, somehow at the edges of experience, at the edges of life, in which one confronts enigma or boundless space. That's transcendence. It's transcendence as beyondness. And such instincts to think that that is what transcendence means are precisely not friendly to traditional theological ways of putting things, at least Christian theological ways. If we accept that sublime art is concerned aesthetically to evoke conceptual ideas of infinity in a distinctively modern vein, then we may conclude that it's not equipped to open any particularly privileged way to an appreciation of the divine glory, at least in traditional Christian terms. Like certain strands of philosophy's fascination with alterity, otherness, or phenomenologies with limit experiences of various kinds, we may say that the art of the sublime will show itself inadequate for approaching the question of the transcendence of the Christian God. And yet, Christians claim God can be apprehended in some way in the midst of creaturely reality. It just won't be this way, the way of sublime, narrowly or exclusively conceived as the not beautiful. So what alternative is there, if any? The answer would, I think, be a surprising one and perhaps an unwelcome one to many moderns. It is the incarnational turn to the body, and with it to the particularity of persons, that opens for a Christian tradition of art its best possible chance at transcendence. And that's a bold suggestion I want to make, that an image like this is as much an image of transcendence as an image like the Watts that you remember seeing at the beginning, or indeed the Turner. The art of the embodied Christ does not, of course, capture or describe God's transcendence, doesn't capture it. Rather, it relinquishes its desire to realize it as a human idea or image and prepares itself to receive the unsettling intuition in faith that God is beyond any artificial border that we may set up between what is interior to the world and what is exterior to it. There is nothing in relation to which God is outside or beyond. God is not contained within the created order, nor is God in his transcendence comparable to anything created. But to make God simply outside the created order is at the same time to delimit God in a way that is not theologically sensible. It's effectively to make God something which you can distinguish the world over against. That's to limit God and to make God less transcendent than God really is. God is beyond the difference between creaturely things and God. God is, if you like, both radically immanent and radically transcendent. So the surpassingness of God's transcendence is in no way the surpassingness we sense when we feel the limits of our powers of perception or cognition, our powers of rational apprehension. And yet to address ourselves to the body or the face or the words of Christ, as artists and writers have encouraged us to do in countless ways, is to do something different. Ecce homo is their proper invitation to ask the question, who are you, of Christ? As Dietrich Bonhoeffer has insisted, this is the only genuine way to approach the transcendence of God, rather than the transcendence of limit experiences or limit thoughts. Or, to put it another way, it is to encounter a limit at the centre of life, a limit at the centre of life, and not just at its edges. To encounter one who resists our possessive appropriation, and yet is wholly embodied and real and historical. Bonhoeffer writes, "Behold God become human, the unfathomable mystery of the love of God for the world. God loves human beings. God loves the world. Not an ideal human being, but human beings as they are. Not an ideal world, but the real world. What we find repulsive in their opposition to God, what we shrink back from with pain and hostility, namely real human beings, the real world, this is for God the ground of unfathomable love. It is not enough to say that God embraces human beings, for this affirmation rests on an infinitely deeper one, namely that God, in the conception and birth of Jesus Christ, has taken on humanity bodily." And this is what brings me back to the dialogue that I began by describing with Vivienne Jabry, the Professor of War Studies, and the notion of the centrality of the body to the artistic task as a way of resisting the shock and awe tactics of the Iraq War. It's that return to the body, which in her case was not grounded in any sort of theological affirmation like Bonhoeffer's, and that in itself is interesting, but which became for us a meeting point because the theological commitments I brought to the conversation were very much in line with what Jabry was wanting to argue for in her own terms. When war is spectacle, experience and its materiality in the body are somehow occluded or obscured from view. But there's a sense in which art can desublimate, enabling resistance to that which seeks to produce awe, at least when that awe is destructive or deceptive. But for Jabry, her emphasis on the desublimation of art was premised upon what she felt to be an insurmountable opposition between the idea of the sublime and the fragile fact of the human body. And this is where, having converged, we then parted company again, and really genuinely again from my side on theological grounds. And in a sense, I think she was simply rehearsing this modern problem that you can't reconcile the sublime with the fragile human form. They couldn't, for her, be reconciled in the same space. In other words, the body had to overcome the sublime, or as it were, dislodge it. There couldn't be any kind of reconciliation between them. The totalizing, universalizing pretensions of the sublime must always in the end eclipse or crush the human form and the depiction of human-scale things, the body and its suffering above all. The depiction of human-scale things are to be understood as a necessary act of resistance to the sublime, a necessary desublimation of its excesses, especially when harnessed by those ambitions to wield absolute power. But what about this, representative of an ancient Christian tradition, which thinks that glory and the human form are quite compatible? Here's David Bentley Hart again. A Christian understanding of affirmation entirely reverses the logic of the modern or postmodern sublime by proceeding from a theological account of beauty, a beauty in which a truer sublime, the inexhaustible glory of being, is contained. A truer sublime. So not, as it were, a straight rejection of the sublime, but a truer sublime which he equates with the inexhaustible glory of being. And the crucial thing, I think, about this image and images like it in the Eastern tradition is the belief that there can be this truer sublime, this extraordinary glory of being, in fact God's glory, which shines through being, and that rather than having to obliterate the human form, it precisely emanates from it or radiates through it. So there is, this, if you like, a simultaneity of the human form and of the Christian sublime, of glory, which breaks out and illuminates the world, not in order to show it its limits and fragility, but precisely to show its coherence and its beauty. When I gave an earlier version of this paper very recently, I nearly said, well, I did say, in fact, and then I immediately regretted it, that the body has to be centre stage for a Christian art. And this was actually to a gathering which included a lot of young Christian artists. And I immediately regretted it because I don't think that an art informed by this Christian sensibility needs always to have bodies in it. But I do think it needs to have a particular sort of sensitivity to questions of how the human figure, the human person, relates to her context and the order in which she finds herself and lives. And I'm going to just finish a couple of images of contemporary art, which seems to me is genuinely addressing this sense of human scale, human presence, human relationship to a wider non-human environment. This is Marina Abramovich, who performed her work, The Artist is Present, quite recently in MoMA in New York. Did anybody have the good fortune to see this in action? It's a performance work. And what she did was, for a 3-month period, every single day, whenever the gallery was open, so it was for a total of something over 700 hours, she sat at a chair, at a table. Across the table from her was another empty chair, and anybody who visited the museum was invited to come and sit in that chair opposite her. She said nothing, she simply sat there, and everybody who came and sat in the chair across from her was photographed. So there's a record of all the people who sat there over these 700 plus hours, and you can go online and see all of their faces. And also how long they chose to sit, because everybody had the choice to stay for as little or as long a time as they wanted to. And some people stayed a very long time. Some people came back several times. Some people either couldn't stand it or had other things to do and were just there for sort of, 30 seconds or something. But if you look through the photographs, you do see some very extraordinary responses from some of the people. I apologise for the quality of some of these, they're not very good. But this is Marina Abramovich herself. But a great many people wept. And you'll see this if you look at the record, the photographic record. Others showed signs of delight or of amusement. Some are very difficult to read. The weeping ones are the most arresting, so that's the why I've chosen to show you these. Well, this is an art, it seems to me, of a sublimity which is at the same time utterly centred around human encounter. I think that part of what is happening in these encounters is that people are coming up against a sort of transcendence. It's what Levinas would describe in terms of the fundamental ethical obligation that arises when two people face one another. That sense of as it were, of a great gulf at the same time as an extraordinary affinity between two human beings. So it's both sublime and human, and that, I think, is why I think it's a rather wonderful piece of work. And then this is a painting called Abide by a young British artist called Anna Freeman, who I think is really, really interesting, and if you get a chance to see some of her work, you should. Her work, it seems to me, and this is why I think to say that the human body should be centre stage because she's a Christian, I should say, not that that's something she proclaims through her art, but she is. This is not her work. Her paintings generally don't have human figures in them, but what they do is show human interiors. They are about the human, even though they don't explicitly show human bodies. And she's very fascinated by interiors where there's a sense of incongruence, loss, nostalgia, longing. She often paints the interiors of junk shops, where things have lost their original home, and often very splendid and quite expensive objects are put alongside very ordinary domestic ones, as if they're all waiting in some lumber room for a new home, where they can sort of be themselves again. But in being there, that expresses something profoundly human. I mean, she sees these objects as expressing something very profound about the human condition, where we too, if you like, have a sense of a home, she argues, that we've lost, and look for a home that we might one day again receive. And quite apart from that, just in formal terms, I think she's doing some very interesting things quite deliberately in order to, as she puts it, to overcome traditional hierarchies, particularly Baroque ones. She's sort of fascinated by the Baroque, but also wants to break it up and complicate it. Because Baroque is about filling available space in a clear hierarchical structure in which everything is made sense of. And actually, she thinks that gives us something, the apparent fulfillment of a longing, which actually it can't really satisfy. She thinks the Baroque sort of makes us feel our longing has been satisfied, and then actually we realise it hasn't, and that this isn't enough. We want something more than this. It's, if you like, the Baroque stepping into the place where heaven should be. And so her broken Baroque, as I call it, is I think, making an important gesture that our real home is something we have to hope for beyond the spaces that we can fill. There's a lot more I could say about Anna's work, but I'll just leave you with this one image. I think I've used up my allotted time, and I want to allow time for you to ask me questions and for us to have a discussion, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben. You've got us all to a really wonderful start. Huge amount there to think about. I'm glad all this is going on the web so that we can hear that again and think further. We have some time for questions. Could I just begin by picking up something at the beginning, historical point? It wasn't quite clear how you understood the relationship between the sublime and the romantic movement, which has been well described, for instance, as it takes form with David Caspar Friedrich as spilt religion. Could you just say something very briefly about that?
Yes, I mean, the art of the sublime has a particular relationship with the romantic movement, and I suppose that my concentration on Kant's thought is an attempt in a sort of slightly over-tidied up way to diagnose what are the origins of that, what becomes that very significant romantic option, which then is fully embraced. But I think that I suppose what I was suggesting, that Kant sets things up in such a way that there are two routes out of it. If you don't succeed in holding them together in the way that he tried to. And one is the more classicising rationalist route. And if that goes its way, its sort of correlate will be that you get an art of the romantic art, which is that of the
spilt religion.
Spilt religion, and with this enormous sense of sublimity residing in nature.
If in effect you start with the Renaissance as you did, it seems perfectly reasonable to describe the body as being central to Christian art. But of course there's a prehistory to that. And if you go back to the early days, the iconoclasts lost, but there was a very, very significant current of early Christianity related obviously to the Judeo-Christian origins, which would have said that not only is the body not central to Christian art, it is absolutely banned and anathema to Christian art. And of course we still see that current very strongly today in Islam. So would you like to comment on that in the context of your talk?
You're right. I mean, it's perhaps the most important decision that was ever made for Christian art by the church, that it was not idolatrous to create images, and in particular to create images of Christ. And I'm very glad they did make that decision. There's more to it than just whether it's idolatrous. And I think that the idea that if you have a human form on the wall of your church, you might end up worshipping it. That seems to me much less interesting as an objection and easier to overcome. I think the idea that people are worshipping the images is too unsophisticated a reading of how people in fact relate through visual images to God. But there was a very interesting argument at the time of the initial iconoclastic controversy, which was that you were undoing what this famous Council of Chalcedon had affirmed, which is to say that the fact that the two natures of Christ must never be divided or separated. They mustn't be confused either, but they mustn't be divided or separated. That you were undoing that by painting Jesus Christ, because you could only in fact show the human nature. You can't show the divine nature in a painting or in a sculpture. So you're only showing one nature, and that's an un-Chalcedonian thing to have done. I think that's a very interesting argument, and some of the ways in which artists have indirectly shown the divine nature without actually, you can't directly, literally show it, are really subtle. And a classic example is Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew, which has the Christ figure holding out his finger in a deliberate echo of Michelangelo's creation on the roof of the Sistine Chapel, creation of Adam on the roof of the Sistine Chapel. And the finger is in the position of the finger of God, but is in fact the hand of Adam, which is a brilliant way of communicating the two natures indirectly. And there are other examples by other artists of that. There's some terrible mistakes, like the tradition of painting the Trinity as an old man supporting the arms of the cross with a dove flying in between them, which seemed to me very terrible. But,
next question, please. Yes, the lady there.
Looking at the luminous mystery of the Friedrichs and the Turner paintings, I wonder if you could comment on Anesh Kapoor's ascension from the Venice Biennale, where he has this great light going through the church, up through the roof, whether, because of the debate that is going on at the moment about conceptual art being a con, I am wondering whether you would regard the work of that great humanist painting as something that comes within the survey that you are making.
Thank you very much. It's a very, very good question, and it does really challenge the sort of over-neat oppositions I'm setting up, because I think that's an extraordinary work, and I love Turner. I mean, I don't want you to get me wrong. I think these, as you call them, luminous works can be profoundly affirming of the universe that we're a part of, as well as challenging our place in it. And actually, after all, we do need to be challenged in terms of our place in this universe a little bit. It's not that this should be art, that a sort of art that seems compatible with a Christian theological outlook should simply be telling us that this is a world made for us to enjoy and be at the middle of. That sort of anthropocentrism doesn't seem to be necessarily a good outcome as we wreak more and more havoc on the non-human environment. So works of art that remind us of our relationship with an extraordinarily luminous world around us, which we are part of, seem to me to have a very important place. And at that point, I suppose you'd need to say, how... you need to think in terms of a larger context of art, where the connections are also made between us and those affirmations of sublime space. So it's not that we shouldn't have them. Some images actually manage to do it all in one image, like the Transfiguration icon. I think to some extent like Anna Freeman's work, and there are other examples of that, all happening in one image. In some cases, it's that, as it were, the whole oeuvre of an artist will show how those connections might be explored, and not every single work has to, eschew sublimity. So thank you for the question.
Thanks. Can I just ask about the effect of the pieces of art or the sculptures and so on across, say, churches or cathedrals, and how that actually affects the architecture of the places, rather than just being an individual work of art itself that we may look at?
So the way in which a whole range of works of art work together in a place?
Either in one space or across spaces, how it actually affects our Christian places of worship.
Gosh, it's a huge question.
And it will be addressed actually in one of the later lectures.
Yes, we're going to have the later talk on cathedrals and recent cathedral commissions. But just a short answer as a kind of holding position until then is that the relations between works of art have been profoundly important in the past in Christian terms. I mean, you only have to look at large schemes like San Marco, the frescoes in San Marco, the Fra Angelico frescoes, to see how those schemes work to form the lives of the people who move amongst them through different physical spaces. And the cathedrals I think, aspire to something similar if they have an intelligent way of thinking about the works in context and how they relate to their context and to one another in that context, which I think is really important. There is perhaps, it's become easier for us in a modern context to think of artworks as aside from where they appear. I mean, some artists take great trouble to remind us of, to draw our attention to the way that the work they have made belongs somewhere. But a lot of works of art are sort of almost hermetically sealed, such that they can be moved anywhere, and doesn't really matter where, but because they are themselves. And I think that's not... Well, that closes off some of the possibilities that might otherwise arise for the viewer.
Could I come to the picture you showed about Rakib Shaw, the one of the lotus flowers and so on, which you said when you look at it is savage? I must admit, it seemed to me savage right from the very beginning.
Well, I've given you a detail. So if you came into the main exhibition hall at White Cube, and from a distance, the first, in my experience, the first thing you saw was the flowers, and on a huge canvas, sort of across this room. And you thought, gosh, what an amazing picture of flowers. I mean, it was almost like extremely opulent wallpaper, Chinese wallpaper or something like that. And then, not long afterwards, you suddenly started to see these details. So this is a detail.
That's I see.
And so it jumps out a bit more at you.
But it does pose questions about nature, tooth and claw.
It does.
Which obviously Blake was very worried about, which worries me. And it also worries me that I seem to sit in a lot of groups of church people who have been walking in the country and come back and say how wonderful nature is. And if only we could all get on with each other, what a wonderful place the world would be. And I have no answer to the problem, but I want to state it because it is one that I find extremely worrying, that so many people in the pew don't seem to address it at all.
Yes, and the number of soppy hymns about lovely nature, and all of, that tradition makes it can be quite disabling for certainly artists from some Christian traditions to sort of address the darker side, if you like. I think that's a real problem. It's one of the reasons why a lot of Christian art seems trivial. So I take the point. I think that what's interesting is if you look back to an earlier, largely pre-modern tradition of thought about the beauty of nature, it's quite compatible with the monstrousness of aspects of nature. The monstrous is often incorporated in a sense of the providential character of the creation, within which human beings are only one part, and that yes, there is death and violence and sex and all of that stuff which doesn't appear in most of our hymns, but that those are actually part of the beauty of nature. And it's when, as it were, you You can no longer have a rich enough account of the beautiful such that it can accommodate that, and instead sort of have a separate department where those things get put, the sublime or whatever, or the grotesque or whatever else it might be, these other aesthetics than the beautiful, that you get a diminished sense of the beautiful. So that's to say there's a place for the darkness and the red in tooth and claw. This, I think, goes to another level, and to a point where I think there's something, it's perhaps out of a sense of longing. Shaw talks in those terms. He talks about paradise lost, which does imply a sense of a paradise that might once have been, or that might yet be. But I think it's expressing a metaphysic, some sort of metaphysical view of the fundamental violence of the world we inhabit that I don't think should be embraced in an unqualified way by a Christian. I think, there's a way in which an affirmation of the creation as God's good creation, despite anything that might have gone wrong with it, needs to inform a sort of resistance to the idea that it's simply a sort of only a play of violence, or that violence is the most profound thing about it, or the most ultimate thing about it.
I was just wondering on the theme or idea of participation in terms of, on the one hand, the body, and the reasoning which would say the only way to understand the body, human body, is through the Incarnation, and the only way to understand that is through the body of Christ in the Eucharist, which is through participation, in the implications of that for art, in terms of perceiving beauty, that it's not something that one can do from afar, but it involves an integral degree of embracing what one's seeing, so one actually is participating in it on a sort of Eucharistic parallel.
Thank you. I think I agree. It raises interesting questions about what sort of participation goes on when we look at a work of visual art. Music literally sounds through our bodies. We feel the vibrations of music when it's played, and we are not we don't have to be the musicians for it to sound through us. So there's a particular sort of participation there. I think there's a richer vocabulary for how we participate in visual experiences of visual art being developed. For example, Stephen Patterson's written about, and others have written about, the idea of haptic vision, haptic meaning touch, that there's a way of seeing which is a form of almost like, it bears analogies with touch. And if one becomes conscious of those possibilities, of a way of seeing that is perhaps through a particular quality of attention, what Geoffrey Hill might call a particular pitch of attention, achieves a more contemplative investment in the work or relationship with the work, then one might also have works of art that seek to elicit that more, that are not just the works of a moment, but actually reward long contemplation, which is a form of participation, a contemplative approach, where one becomes almost united with the object that one looks at. So thank you for the question.
Well, thank you, Ben, very much for a wonderful start to the morning. Let's give them a round of applause. And the usual
Thank you.
For more information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.